In this unit, we're going to talk about how the first colonies were developed in America, and so therefore it is named Colonial America. Make sure you know it is period 2, 1607 to 1754, and we are currently in Unit 3. Here's a list of all 13 of the original colonies and what group they belong to, whether it was New England, Middle Colonies, or Southern Colonies. Make sure that you can place and color code them on the map. So let's start in the South. Of course, we have to start with Jamestown, the very first successful settlement, although it did not start out very successful. Now, the original Jamestown people were smart about some things. You can notice from the map over here on the side that they did not park their new place right on the shore as they landed. They actually traveled up the James River. They named it the James River after King James, and they created their town so that they were right off the river with a good water supply, and they were far enough in that they were offered some protection from the elements right on the major shoreline. Notice too that they also ended up developing their settlement in a triangle pattern. And that was pretty smart of them. Second smart thing that they did it so that it was easier to protect, because protecting 3 sides takes a lot less men than protecting 4 sides. So these guys weren't completely without knowledge of how to survive, but going inland and developing the triangle development is kind of the end of their intelligence, and we'll see what happens to them after that. So the first trip to Jamestown took place in May of 1607. Make sure that you know the 3 ships that arrived to develop Jamestown. So it would be the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. Now, the King of England did not want to do this through proprietorship, as it had been done before, or at least attempted before, where a single individual or the crown itself controlled all the money that was invested in the trip, because there had been attempts before and they had been failures. So this time it was done as a business venture to make lots of people rich, including the Crown of England. And so it was done through the Virginia Company of London, which is a joint stock company. You should know what that is by now. In a joint stock company, you only can lose what you actually invested. It doesn't have anything to do with your personal property. So if the company goes under, you don't lose your home or anything like that. So the king, along with some rich individuals in London or in England, decided that they would take part in this and support the building of the 3 ships and sending people over to the New World. Now, the first settlers, there were 104 of them. Of course, they were all males in the beginning. They didn't want families. They wanted to make sure that it was safe. They were also usually not first sons. You should know by now the word primogeniture, which means in Europe, the practice of a father passing along everything he owns to just the eldest son, and that eldest son gets to decide if any of his siblings get any of daddy's goods, and usually the answer was a resounding no. So you've got second, third, fourth, and so on sons coming to the New World looking for their wealth that they're not going to get from their father at home. Now, the initial struggles basically are the fact that these men do not know how to do hard work. And before long, many of the 104 are going to pass away. And believe it or not, a lot of them got sick from something as simple as blisters on their hands. They had never worked with their hands before. And the shoveling and the building and just everything that they suddenly had to find themselves doing in order to survive led to simple little blisters on their hands, and they didn't know how to take care of those. So a lot of them got blood poisoning when their blisters got infected, and they actually died because of that. So they're not real sure how to survive here. They definitely don't know how to grow any crops. Most of them weren't very good at building, so what they did build was in pretty bad shape. And on top of all of that, they were surrounded by about 14,000 natives who all spoke the same language. They were controlled by one very powerful leader by the name of Powhatan. So they all spoke Algonquin, which is a difficult language. These first settlers could not understand it, and so they're kind of at the mercy of the elements and at the mercy of these new native tribes that they've come in contact with. Pretty scary stuff. So they weren't doing very well, as I said. And so by January 1608, they're not even there for a year. There's only 38 men left. And this is when John Smith shows up. John Smith was sent by the crown to check on what was happening in the new colony, bring supplies, things like that. And when he got to the new colony, he realized that the men had basically given up. None of them were working. The woods were full of animals that they could have been hunting, but they weren't. The waters were full of fish. They weren't even trying to fish anymore. They were basically depending on what the kindness of the local Indian tribes and what little they were willing to give them as far as food. And so these men were basically starving to death. So John Smith got them very organized, and he created a very strict policy of no work, no food. So get up and do your job, or you will not eat at the end of the day. And he was not a very liked man because of that. We know in hindsight that this was a right decision, and he was trying to get them to learn how to survive, but they hated him for it. One of the things that he realized he needed to work on was relationships with these local Indian tribes, and so he went straight to the source. He met with Powhatan, and Powhatan did not like John Smith, and so he decided that he was going to put him to death. And this is where the story of Pocahontas comes in, and Disney makes it this super romantic love story, but it wasn't. Pocahontas, from all accounts, did save John Smith. Now, did she throw her body across him and tell her father that she was in love with John Smith and that he couldn't kill him, yada, yada? No, that did not happen. But she did save him, and this is because Pocahontas, being 12 to 14 years old, we're not exactly sure how old she was, but she was pretty young. Pocahontas was smart enough to realize if her father, Powhatan, killed John Smith, that it was going to lead to an out-and-out war. And so she wasn't saving John Smith because she was in love with him. She actually didn't like the man herself, but she did it to save her own people and to save her father from doing something silly that would cost a lot of lives. So I do have to tell you as a side note, many years later, John Smith found out that Pocahontas was in England, and she was at a very large party, and he went to meet with her. And by that time period, he was trying to sell a book that he had written about his adventures in America with Powhatan and the early settlers. And he thought that if he could get Pocahontas, who was kind of a tourist attraction, on board with promoting this book, that the book would be super successful. And so he went to meet with her thinking, she hadn't seen him in a long time, she would be glad to see him, and she refused to meet with him. She never liked the man, and she certainly was not going to help him sell his book. And so the story goes that she locked herself in a room and said that she would stay there for eternity if that's how long he stood outside the door. And so she never opened the door, and they never met face to face, and they never saw one another again. So just kind of proves that the story of Disney is just romanticized. Anyway, back in Jamestown, by 1609, John Smith was not very well liked by anybody, but he was still working on Indian relations, and so he was kind of out isolated by himself, trying to speak to some of the local tribes. Night fell, and he laid down to rest, and mysteriously, gunpowder that he had attached to a string around his waist blew up while he was sleeping and basically blew his hip off. He was severely injured. He does linger in the colony for more than a year trying to get better, but he just never does get any better. And so eventually he's going to go home to England to get better. He'll come back to America later, but this is it for him in Jamestown. And a man by the name of Percy takes over once John Smith is too unhealthy. Now, Percy was an idiot, and he had hated the no work, no food policy, and so he completely did away with it. In the meantime, between John Smith trying to recover in Jamestown and Percy taking over, England didn't know that any of this was happening, and so they sent more people over to Jamestown. And so in the winter of 1610, there were 500 people in Jamestown, and this was families this time. This was men, women, and children. And we look back on that now as the starving time of Jamestown. By the end of the winter, there were only 60 people left. This time period offers the very first documented cases of cannibalism in America. These people had turned to eating their dead. They ate their dogs, their cats, they ate rats, they ate poison snakes, anything that they could get their hands on. Now, lucky for them, a new group of people will arrive in the spring, and these people actually know what they're doing. They know how to build, they know how to hunt, they know how to farm and test the soil to make it successful. So by 1613, they're not doing too bad, but they're not competitive agriculturally until a brand new crop is brought in 1613, and that crop is a new version of tobacco that had been mated with a European version and an American version, and it's going to be super successful. Can you name the guy who brought it? Let's see on the next slide. It was John Rolfe. John Rolfe is the man who will marry Pocahontas. Again, this is a little side story, but he does marry Pocahontas. We'll get to that later. Did she love him? We don't know, but he was a heck of a lot better than John Smith. So we'll talk a little bit more about that marriage in a minute. But John Rolfe did bring in this new tobacco, and tobacco, if you've never worked in a tobacco field, is very labor intensive. Harvesting of tobacco has to still be done by hand, and so it is a lot of bending over because you have to cut it at the bottom of the stalk, close to the ground, stand up, put it on a hook, and so it's up and down, very labor intensive, and then you have to hang it to dry. So what you do is you build a giant barn, and I actually worked in a tobacco field when I was a kid, and the barn that we used was 9 stories. So these guys would have had 2 to 3 stories, but you have a different person standing on the rafters on all stories, whether it's 2 or 9, and you hand the tobacco up to one another until it's at the top, and then you work your way down. So imagine at the top of a barn that is, even if it's only 3 stories high, in the summer, how hot that is. It's very demanding, very hot work, but it was successful. So they do need people that are willing to work in the tobacco fields. There's still a bunch of rich people here, and they're not going to do a lot of it themselves, and so they need somebody to do the hard work, and so they start using indentured servants. Now, the indentured servants that they got for the tobacco fields were mostly Scottish and Irish. And if you've ever met anybody from Scotland or Ireland, they have their own way of doing things, and they can be a little bit demanding. So they had to add some kind of deal to sweeten the pot. And so the Virginia Company came up with something called the headright system in 1618. And the headright system offers free land to people that are willing to come over here and be indentured servants. And at the end of their servitude, they would get anywhere from 30 to 50 acres of their own, basically for free. You worked your contract off to get over here, whether it's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and at the end of it, you get land. It definitely did sweeten the pot. So you've got indentured servants coming to Jamestown left and right. Now in 1619, there was an import of slaves that was completely by accident. There was a man who was delivering a group of slaves to the Spanish-controlled islands in the Caribbean, where there were sugarcane plantations already in place. And somehow, some way, this guy got so lost that he ended up in Jamestown instead of the Caribbean. Well, by the time that he found Jamestown, his salvation, he's going to get food and resupplied, is what he thinks. He has nothing left on his ship. There's no supplies left. There's no food left. The only thing left is people. And so the kind people of Jamestown said, if you don't have something to trade us, we're not going to give you any supplies, no food, no nothing. And the only thing this man had was the slaves. And so he ended up trading slaves for food and supplies, and we suddenly get the very first slaves on American soil. Now, it was immediately obvious that these slaves were healthier than any of the natives that they had been trying to enslave in Jamestown, and they were much more agreeable than the Scottish and the Irish were as indentured servants. So right away, it is super obvious that slaves coming out of Africa are good workers, hard workers, healthy workers, and this is the first little inkling of having a successful slave-driven agricultural system in America, and it was done by accident. So if this had never happened, would slavery have been different? Who knows? Maybe we never would have used it. But Jamestown is the first time that we see slaves in America, and again, it was done by accident. So we have to go back to the Powhatan tribes because they're still around, and things are going to get really super heated up after John Smith goes away. So there were about 30 tribes under Powhatan's control. They were known as the Powhatan Confederacy because he's the guy controlling all of them. And there were about 200 settlements in all of these Powhatan natives. And there's going to be a war because the Powhatan have had it with the way that they're being treated. Their lands are being overrun. There's less to hunt, less to fish, and the whites are kind of ignorant about, well, not kind of, they are. They're ignorant about the way that they're treating the natives. And so a war is going to start in 1610. And the bad thing for the natives is that there was a guy on board one of those ships coming to Jamestown in 1610. His name was Lord Delaware, and he was a true guerrilla warfare expert. He had been fighting in Ireland for a really long time, and he had learned from the Irish how to do guerrilla warfare, where you can sneak into a town, have the whole thing on fire before anybody knows what's going on, and burn it to the ground. Hide in trees and throw things at people, hit them with rocks in the head, and he liked it. That's the worst part of it. Not just that he was good at it and he had learned to be one of the best. It was that he really liked it. And so he's in charge of fighting against these Powhatan, and he's doing some serious damage. So in 1614, Pocahontas decides to give the ultimate sacrifice here, and she marries the guy who is the most important guy in Jamestown, and that would be John Rolfe. So she marries him in 1614, and they stay here in America for about 8 years. And in those 8 years, everything is pretty peaceful because the two of them are here, keeping things between their two groups of people peaceful. So since Jamestown finally has an opportunity to kind of sit still, they have an opportunity to build that infrastructure of their political system. And so they developed the Virginia House of Burgesses. It's the first General Assembly in 1619, first one in all of America, and it is the first time that they vote people into a political office. It is still around today. And you need to look it up and find out what it is. So in Virginia, that Virginia House of Burgesses, what did it become? Look it up. I can't teach you everything. Sometimes you got to do for yourself. Eventually, John Rolfe wants to go home. So after 8 years of living here with pretty peaceful conditions, he decides that he is going to take Pocahontas. He's going to dress her up like an English woman. He's going to rename her Rebecca, and he's going to take her to England, where she becomes kind of like I said, a tourist attraction. People are just mystified by her. Somewhere along the lines, she does have a little girl. We don't know exactly what happened to the baby, but Pocahontas dies, and we're not really sure exactly what she died of. There's lots of different theories, but she dies young, and her baby girl disappears. So, but the point of it is that she leaves, and so does John Rolfe. And so there's going to be another war. Peace is broken. I know you do not have to know this gentleman's name, but we're going to call him OPEC. And OPEC decided that if Jamestown was going to start misbehaving, that he needed to act fiercely and fast. And so within the first year, in 1622, he killed about a third of the people in Jamestown, burned parts of it down. He really thought that if he did this fast and furious, that he would be able to come to them at the end of the year and say, see, now you know what I'm capable of, back off, and there would be peace again. And Jamestown basically said that, you're right, we're sorry, we're going to give up, you're better at this than us. And so they promised that they were going to back off, but they didn't. They snuck into the grounds of OPEC and his people and the Powhatan people and poisoned their crops. And in one night, they killed enough crops to have fed 4,000 people through the winter. And so people began to die of starvation, the Powhatan people. And before you know it, the Powhatans are gone. And they died of starvation, which is a really horrible way to die. And where the Powhatans had fed the Jamestown people at the worst times, these same people, these Jamestown people, are going to stand back and watch the Powhatan starve to death. And so that is the end of the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, because it is the end of the Powhatan Indians, sadly enough. So you would think that now Jamestown is going to be peaceful for a while, but it's not. So in 1632, you end that Second Powhatan War. The Powhatan Indians are gone. That doesn't mean there's no tribes left, but the most powerful and united one, those of the Powhatan, are gone. And so by 1676, you would think that things would be settled, but not so much. In 1676, only 100 years before America gets her independence from England, there are two gentlemen in Jamestown. One is a pretty pitiful farmer by the name of Nathaniel Bacon. He's a drinker, he's a gambler, he's a big mouth, and he thinks it's cool to befriend indentured servants, because even though he's not like a rich guy, he is one step above them, and so they're fascinated that this guy will befriend them. So he's their leader. Well, there's also the governor, and his name is Berkeley. And Berkeley's kind of a no-nonsense kind of guy. But both men, Nathaniel Bacon being a farmer and having all these friends that work farms, and Governor Berkeley and everyone else in Jamestown is concerned with the fact that tobacco prices are falling. Other colonies had developed, and they were all competing with one another, and so the prices are going lower and lower and lower. Also by 1676, the rules of mercantilism had really kicked in. And remember, mercantilism, the point of it is to make the mother country rich, even if it hurts the baby countries or the colonies. And so mercantilism was cutting into the profits in the colonies, because so much money had to go back to the mother countries. It also happened that in 1676, the year before and after, there was some bad weather, and so the crops weren't doing that great anyway. And so here, all these people are very frustrated with the things that are going on at the time, and they're not, of course, going to take it out on themselves. They're going to take it out on the local native tribes. So the real blow up between these surrounding tribes and Jamestown actually started with a guy by the name of Thomas Matthews. Thomas Matthews was not super intelligent. He was a plantation owner that decided that he was going to get seed and supplies from some of the local natives, a local tribe. And when they came to ask for payment, he said, "I'm not paying you." And so this local tribe sent in some members basically to threaten Thomas Matthews. You've got so much time, and if you don't pay us, then we're going to attack your farm. We're going to burn it down. We're going to hurt you. They threatened him. And so he tells all his friends about this, and he's saying to his friends, "I think I need to pay these guys." It was kind of scary. And his friends say, "No, no, no, we will take care of it for you." So Thomas Matthews is not even involved in retaliating. So these guys who really didn't know anything about the tribe he had borrowed from or anything else go off into the woods looking for this local tribe to take out revenge. Well, they came across a group of local Indians, didn't know what tribe they were from, didn't even ask, murdered them in the name of Thomas Matthews, and it ends up being natives from the wrong tribe. So now you've got two tribes that are upset at the Jamestown people, the one that Thomas Matthews had jilted, and the one who now lost some innocent members of their tribe because of Thomas Matthews' stupid friends. So things are going to get really, really out of hand. Other native groups are also going to kind of start voicing their discontent with Jamestown, and it's all starting to come to a really ugly head. So Governor Berkeley says to these local tribes, "Look, I'm going to order an investigation of exactly what happened. People will be punished for doing things wrong. I promise you. But please, please, let's just look at this logically. Let's talk about it. I would like all of you chiefs to come into Jamestown, and we'll sit down. We'll figure out a way to do this, to settle things, to make everybody happy. And so these local tribal chiefs do agree to it. They're in Berkeley's office. They're discussing how to fix things. The door suddenly burst open, and a group of men comes in and kills all the tribal chiefs. So complete chaos starts. And of course, men are going to start organizing groups to go after these Indian people. Supposedly they're the bad guys, right? So Bacon is one of these men. He's actually the leading man that organizes this volunteer band of Indian murderers. And most of them were his indentured servants' friends. And he gave them orders saying that there is no difference between good or bad Indians. Kill them all. And so this out and out murdering, chaotic event takes place with Bacon as the leader. So it's a quick, ugly, horrible thing. But in the end, Jamestown is burned to the ground not by the Indians necessarily. Mostly it's burned to the ground by these indentured servants who had just gotten crazy and thought that there was no law enforcement anymore and you can just do whatever makes you happy in the moment. And so they burned down most of Jamestown themselves. In that time period as well, Bacon had a huge, horrible case of lice. He did not bathe like a lot of people didn't back then, but he had lice so terrible that he got skin infections from it, and he died in the heat of all of this from blood poisoning. So he didn't get punished. I'm sure he would have, but he didn't get punished. He died. Governor Berkeley was removed from office, and eventually he was sent back to England. 23 of those indentured servants were hung for their crimes, so they did actually punish the men involved. Now, did they punish them for killing Indians or punish them for burning down Jamestown? You know what I'm saying? But at least there were people punished. But here's the kicker to it all, and you probably wouldn't make this connection. Because of what happened between the Jamestown people and the Native Americans, black slavery is going to increase. Now, when you think about it, it's going to make sense to you. It was indentured servants that did most of the damage. So are you going to trust an indentured servant to oversee your giant plantation that you can't constantly see what's going on? You can't monitor human behavior constantly. So are you going to be willing to take on indentured servants who might be bad people doing dishonest things and hurt your property? Or are you going to now take on black slaves who don't cause those kind of problems, who don't burn down Jamestown? So I know it doesn't seem like those two things could be connected, the Bacon's Rebellion and black slavery increasing, but they definitely are connected. So hopefully that made sense to you. Now we need to kind of stand back and look at the significance of Bacon's Rebellion. It is, and this is super important, it is the very first real colonial rebellion where you've got the farmers versus the government, or any group of colonial people versus their own government. And in this case, you've got frontiersmen, which are the farmers, versus the Tidewater people, the government, the big people, the rich people, the people telling you what to do. And these people, for the first time, rose up and said, we're not going to have it. And in fact, burned down half the town. So big, big, big deal. Make sure you know Bacon's Rebellion, first colonial rebellion, lots of damage, lots of death. And of course, as a side, like collateral damage kind of thing, it definitely worsened the racial lines, because now you have the natives who are mad at the whites who are mad at the natives. You've got indentured servants who are mad at the black slaves coming in, taking their jobs. So you've got a lot of racial lines here that had not been crossed either in a long time or ever before. So there you have it. Let's look at Maryland. Maryland was founded in 1634 by a guy by the name of George Calvert. You're going to get to know him as the first Lord Baltimore, or just plain Lord Baltimore. I'm actually telling you that there's going to be more than one. So he's the first one. So George was actually the Secretary of State for James I and Charles I. At that time period, it was illegal for anyone Catholic to be serving in such positions, high positions, for the crown. And George really loved James I and Charles I, and so he decided that he had to fess up and tell Charles that he was actually a Catholic. So, of course, he's going to have to be dismissed from his job. But because Charles also liked George and James had really liked George, they weren't going to, he wasn't going to be punished. So he actually gives him a plot of land in Ireland, and the land is called Baltimore. It's a town called Baltimore in Ireland. And so he is made the controlling figure of Baltimore in Ireland, and so he becomes known as Lord Baltimore. So this sets him up with a lot of money. He's going to be the one that everybody in the town of Baltimore gives taxes to. So he's kind of set for life, and he's being rewarded for being an honest guy. So he decides that he wants to invest money in the New World, and he wants to create a place where it was safe for people to be a Catholic or a Protestant. Now, Maryland was actually a place where Catholics would have a safe haven in the New World, but George Calvert, or Lord Baltimore, same guy, was not against Protestants. And so he develops this place, buys this land in America, names it Maryland after Crazy Mary, Bloody Mary, who killed anybody who was not Catholic in England, Henry VIII's daughter. You guys should remember that from last year in World Two. But he buys the land, and then he actually died before it was officially approved by Charles I. So by the time that it is approved, with George actually being dead, George's eldest son Cecil becomes Lord of Baltimore in Ireland, or Lord Baltimore. And so the land in the New World was given to Cecil, George's son. And Cecil is going to be the one that really solidifies the purchase of this new land called Maryland, or the Catholic haven in the New World. Now, Maryland again was a Catholic haven, but Protestant migrants were allowed to be there. They were not persecuted in any way whatsoever. Now, Cecil wasn't crazy about the thought of traveling on water, so he sent his younger brother Leonard, and Leonard was made governor. Cecil's the guy in charge. He's the one that makes all the rules, and Leonard can't do anything or change anything without permission from Cecil. But Leonard is the physical presence in the colony of Maryland for 42 years. Okay, so in back in England, we've got the English Civil War that is going on. It's going to finally end in 1649. You know what ends it? That is when Oliver Cromwell kidnaps basically Charles I and has him beheaded, because Charles had dissolved Parliament. So England is changing. Persecution of different religions is going to be the new thing, and so the Catholics in Maryland decide that they need something to protect themselves and other Christians in the new land. And so in 1649, they encourage the English government to okay this act of toleration in 1649. It's an actual act, a piece of legislation in 1649, and it was to protect all Christians in Maryland. It is not religious freedom. It is only for Christians. It's especially for Catholics, of course, because Cecil and Leonard and the whole family was very Catholic. But it is still okay to seek out and persecute and burn at the stake anybody who is atheist or Jewish in the colony of Maryland. So it absolutely is not religious freedom. So we have Virginia, which was named after Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. We have Maryland, which was named after her sister, her older sister, Mary. You might remember her as Bloody Mary or Mary the First. And now we have the Carolinas. There is North Carolina and South Carolina, of course, and we'll get into the differences between them in a minute. But we're going to start with their names. Now, they were colonized by Virginians who are still very, very English and feel very dedicated to the crown of England. And so the Carolinas are named for the two Charleses, Charles the First being the father of Charles the Second. Carolina is the Latin version of Charles, and so it is named after those two kings. Now, after Charles I was beheaded by Oliver Cromwell in England, Oliver didn't allow any more colonization to happen. He thought that colonizing new worlds was wrong and sinful. He didn't like the fact that you had to overrun the native populations wherever it was in the world in order to colonize. He just didn't agree with that. And so colonization was stopped during the 9 years that he was in charge of England. So after Oliver dies of natural causes, England is kind of stuck. Do we go back to colonization? Who are we going to have in charge of our country? There's all these questions. And so they decided to restore the crown to royalty. And so after Charles I, remember, has been beheaded by Oliver Cromwell. Oliver's now dead 9 years later. And so they decide to restore the crown by allowing the son of Charles I to take the crown and take the throne. And he is Charles II. So for that reason, he's known as the Restoration King. But he's also known as the Restoration King for allowing colonization to pick up again. And so the Restoration colonies, the first colonies, okayed by the new crown, was North and South Carolina. And so they become known as the Restoration Colonies, and Charles II as the Restoration King. So they are colonized in 1719, and they are separated into North and South almost immediately, because it was very obvious very quickly that they were two very different groups of people that were settling there. The North tended to be a poorer group of people, where the South was much richer. They wanted the large farms or plantations, and so it became two very, very different places in the North and the South. So let's look at that plantation economy in the South. The plantation economy, to begin with, was rice. We're not doing cotton yet. You probably know that cotton is going to be king of the South eventually, but right now we're doing rice. So who is it that is farming it in Virginia? By 1663, when it first came about, slavery wasn't a really, really big thing. And even by 1719, it wasn't. It was Native Americans that were farming that rice. And so both North and South Carolina were very into a slave trade, but it wasn't black slaves coming out of Africa. It was Native Americans that they were enslaving. And some of them that they were enslaving were the Creeks, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, all these tribes that are very, very close to the Carolina borders. Most of them were part of the five civilized tribes later, which we'll get into in another unit. But so make sure you know that the first slavery being used in the Carolinas, North and South, but especially South, was not black slavery. It was, in fact, Native Americans. And now we are on to Georgia, which was settled in 1732. Georgia, of course, was named for one of the King Georges. It was, in fact, George II. It will be his son, George III, that will fight in the Revolutionary War. But George II was a pretty well-loved king, especially by James Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe was given a land grant by George to come to the New World and create a buffer colony for South Carolina, a buffer colony, because South Carolina, with their rice crops, were getting richer and richer and richer, and they had a lot of enemies close by. These enemies included the Spanish in Florida, the French in Louisiana and along the Mississippi River, and all those very powerful Indian allies throughout the region. Indians that were upset that there was slavery taking place, Native American slavery taking place in the colonies of North and South Carolina, but especially in the South with those plantations. And so we've got this buffer colony for South Carolina to protect it. Remember, we're kind of the colonists are kind of all on the same side, and if South Carolina needed protecting, of course the crown is going to want to protect it. And so that's how Georgia came to be. Now, James Oglethorpe wanted it to be a refuge for Protestants. He wanted it to be a refuge for people who had gotten into too much debt in England, or people that had committed small crimes in England. The jails were just overrun. And so he was given permission to allow kind of these no good people to come to the New World and give them a chance to become good people. And it was supposed to kind of clean up England. So we've got people who couldn't pay their debts, people who committed petty crimes, and we've got people who are looking for refuge for all kinds of reasons, but especially, of course, religious refuge. So Oglethorpe decided to be brave and say that no Catholics were allowed in Georgia. No Catholics. So that was brave of him in the time period. So no Catholics, and no slavery was allowed in Georgia either, whether it was Native American or black slavery. So again, no Catholics and no slavery allowed in Georgia by James Oglethorpe. So let's kind of summarize the kind of people that were coming to the southern colonies as they were being developed. Of course, we're going to start with the Cavaliers. Those are rich people that were given land grants by the different kings and queens of England to come and settle the New World for whatever reason. And then, of course, those Cavaliers, being the rich guys, didn't want to put in the hard work that they needed to in order to make a profit in the New World. And so they will get poor immigrants to come through indentured servitude to the New World and work off their debts and work for the Cavaliers. And then, of course, you have slaves. And make sure you understand that it is black slaves slowly and slaves made of Native Americans. So it's both groups being enslaved by English settlers. Government of the South was basically the structure that we see now in the South. It was the birth of it. So you've got a representative government, and of course we've already talked about this. The first step in that representative government was the Virginia House of Burgesses. The members were voted in. Anybody that owned land was allowed to vote, and so we started this country with power between different families being different, and their roles being different, because only landowners are allowed to vote. And in this time period, you're talking about the rich. So the rich are making the decisions. Now there was a governor, and a governor was allowed to veto any law that came out of the House of Burgesses. So you kind of feel like with the Virginia House of Burgesses, there was a lot of local decisions and local power controlling what was happening. But in truth, it wasn't always like that. And of course, it's going to get tighter and tighter control by the crown as time goes on. But from the very beginning, that royal governor, he was selected by the king. So he had more power than anybody, and he was allowed to veto anything that came out of the Virginia House of Burgesses. So the South kept very, very strong ties with Britain in the early 1700s. Now, of course, they're the ones that are going to get super mad at the crown later, near the Revolution era, but in the early 1700s, there were very strong ties because these original rich guys that started the settlement in the first place got the land from the Crown of England. So they felt a dedication to the Crown of England. Make sure you know that in the South, there were very strong ties with Britain and an allegiance there that's going to last for quite a while. The South, of course, is going to get its major income through crops. And this is where early 1700s you start to see the really big plantations. So let's look at what's growing where. You got tobacco in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, rice in South Carolina, indigo in both Carolinas and in Georgia. And of course, in all these places except for Georgia, you do have a slave trade going on. South Carolina being the one who had the most slaves coming and going. And remember, once again, it was mostly kidnapped Indians that were being enslaved. And at one point, South Carolina was making a lot of money shipping those kidnapped, enslaved Indians to the Caribbean. The problem was they didn't survive. They just weren't capable of surviving the extreme heat and the diseases that were brought from the English and given to the natives. So didn't work out very well for the natives at all. Now, of course, we can't imagine that the Southern economy was completely made up of rich guys, because it wasn't. The South had a western portion that was mostly subsistence farmers. So these are going to be people that are not near the best water sources because they didn't have a lot of money to buy the land that was worth more money, which would be stuff near the water. These are guys that got land through the headright system. And as more and more people came through and got land through that system, they were pushed further and further westward. So these become subsistence farmers, mostly people that had at one time been indentured servants, and it was a really rough life. The worst part of it, I think, for these guys is they were very, very isolated from the political side of the Southern economy, and so they did not have any representation. They had nobody really to understand in the House of Burgesses or in any other branch of government what their daily lives were like and what they needed from the crown. So it was not a good life for these guys politically or economically. And most of them were, again, far from water sources, and they were at the foothills of the mountains. So you have very extreme weathers there. And so all in all, it wasn't a great place for these guys to live, and they hated that they had no representation in the political system of the new colonies. So let's look at the two groups together. You've got those rich plantation owners known as the gentry. Their family status was built on land ownership. Now, this is a very, very tiny group of the entire population in the southern colonies. So you're talking 5 to 10% at any given time. But they're the ones that have all the power. They're the ones that are being voted in to political positions, and they are the voice. There is no middle class. Either you are a rich plantation owner or you're a subsistence farmer. To have a middle class, basically you have to have industry, and you don't have that in the South. You've got agriculture. So in truth, these poor subsistence farmers and their servants, or anyone's servants, and the slaves have no power whatsoever. It's completely run by the rich. So make sure you know who's got all the power here, which would be the gentry, and those powerful rich people will live on the coastal lowlands. That's the more wealthy people are going to have the better lands near the water, and the poor are going to live at the foothills of the mountains in the western frontier. So make sure you know who's controlling everything and where each section lives, and the fact that there is no middle class. Let's take a closer look at those slaves and indentured servants. So you've got at one time 3/4 of the people migrating to the Chesapeake were indentured servants, and they came either with a contract to pay their way to get over here, or some of them were prisoners and people that owed debts, and they had to pay off a sentence or an amount of money that they owed back in England. So this is what's happening in the South. Now, as the economy improves in Europe, fewer people are willing to come to the colonies to do this hard work in the colonies and be indentured servants. So we become more and more dependent on black chattel slavery in the South in America. Now, don't forget, in 1619, the first African slaves were brought to Virginia by accident when that captain who was traveling for the Spanish accidentally got lost in a storm, and instead of delivering the slaves to the Caribbean, he ends up stuck in Jamestown, and the only thing he has to trade for food is African slaves. So 1619, completely an accident. But by 1662, now, that's not that long, but by 1662, slavery is codified, it's defined, and it's completely race based. And basically, it means that no whites are allowed to be slaves. So things are not really good for anybody not white already in America by 1662. Whether you were a native or an African, things were not good. And so you start to get these little rumblings among the slave population. And one of the first ones that really made it to the history books is what is now known as the Stono Rebellion, which took place in 1739. If you will click to the next slide, then I will tell you the story of the Stono Rebellion. So in 1739 in South Carolina, by then you have black slaves. 20 slaves are going to meet at the side of the Stono River. And the reason for them meeting is to plan to escape. So they're from several different plantations in the area. Right away, they realize that they're going to need weapons. So they break into a local store called the Hutchinson's store, and they kill the storekeepers. There's two of them, and they steal all the guns and the powder inside, and then they start marching south, collecting other rebels, collecting any weapons that they can find. And finally, after several days, they are surrounded by a group of whites that has been tracking them, and a confrontation takes place. We're not really sure about the numbers of how many slaves there were by then or how many whites there were by then, but we do know the death count. And in that confrontation, you've got 20 whites killed and 40 blacks. And those that were the slaves that were left, of course, were captured, beaten, and sent home. So the thing that you need to know about the Stoner Rebellion, it's the largest slave rebellion prior to the Revolution, and that's really, really important. That already in 1739 the slaves were rising up saying, we're not going to take this anymore. That's important. But what's even more important is what happens to those slaves that were part of the Stoner Rebellion and survived it, and all the other slaves in the South. After the Stoner Rebellion, slaves are no longer allowed to be in control of anything in their lives, basically. They are not allowed to grow their own food anymore. This is when they become completely dependent on their masters for food. So if they misbehave, that food can be removed. They also, after 1739 in the Stoner Rebellion, are no longer allowed to learn how to read. They feel like maybe this meeting at the Stono River might have been planned out by people passing notes from plantation to plantation. And if you take their ability to read away, maybe this can't happen again. So no more being able to read. It was actually made illegal, and a white person could be sent to prison. A black individual that was teaching another black to read could be killed for it. So no more learning to read. They were not allowed to earn money in any way whatsoever. I guess maybe they were afraid they would be able to purchase weapons. So no longer allowed to earn money for anything. And they were not allowed to gather anywhere in groups. Any more than 3 slaves meeting, even on their own plantation, just to talk, was completely, totally outlawed. So you can tell that the whites of the South are getting completely paranoid, and because of the Stoner Rebellion, which was supposed to be for a good thing, to make people aware of the tragedies of slavery and to do away with it in 1739, and all it really did was make conditions worse for all the slaves in the South, which is what always seemed to happen during slave rebellions. So we are done with the southern colonies, and now we are going all the way to the top to learn about the colonies in New England. Of course, we have to start with the Plymouth colony of Massachusetts. So 1620 is when the group of pilgrims will land. You may not know that the pilgrims were actually Puritans, extreme Puritans. The Protestant faith that they were members of was the Calvinist faith. And as I said, they were really, really strict. They believed in something called visible saints. And basically, it means that visible saints are those who are destined to go to heaven. And if you remember studying Calvinism, that if you're a Calvinist, your good work ethic is proof to society that you are one of the chosen that's going to go to heaven. So you are a visible saint, and therefore must make your behavior very visible, and it should only be holy behavior. So on this boat, they had many Calvinists, and they also had 101 indentured servants. So their point was, we need to fill the boat up. Everybody that came on board, of course, had to pay money. And so it was a way to get enough money for everybody to come to the New World. The problem was that the ship, Mayflower, you should know that, the Mayflower got caught up in a storm. And when they were finally set free from the storm, they weren't really, really sure where they were. And they're still on the boat now. They haven't landed. But the indentured servants said,
This is a new place. We don't even know where we are. We're not bound by the Crown of England. We just want out of our contracts. And so they threaten to have a revolt. And so the men of the ship get together and they draw up what is now known as the Mayflower Compact. Now, this is important not only because it settled the revolt, but it is also the very first political document in the New World because when they land, they're going to take it with them. And the Mayflower Compact formed a covenant community, and basically that means that it was between all the men on the boat and God, and it was a promise of the people that they would work together in the New World to create fair laws and a good life. Basically, it was government of the people, by the people, for the people, before it was actually part of our political system and our written documents. So, Mayflower Compact, very, very important. Let's take a minute to look at this rendition of what happened on the Mayflower as they're signing the document, and just kind of see what's happening. It's considered to be pretty accurate. So you see that there is a female in the picture, but she is doing ladies' work. Of course, she's knitting, but she's also standing back. She's not really part of it, and she wasn't going to be part of it because the Mayflower Compact was only signed by men. Notice that it is a mixture of people. So you have one gentleman in there, or actually two gentlemen that look like they could be military. You have the typical pilgrim outfit, the rich Puritan, and then you also have guys that look like they're kind of maybe sailors on the boat, just common sailors. These are the poor indentured servant people. So it's a mixture of men that got together for the first time. And isn't that the melting pot of America for the very first time? Sadly, it does not yet include the ladies. So William Bradford was the guy who mostly wrote the Mayflower Compact. Was also one of the prominent leaders on board the ship, the Mayflower. Once they landed, and the Mayflower Compact was intact, and remember, it was a promise made between all the men on the boat, and of course, the women will do as they're told. They decided that it was time to elect a governor, and William Bradford was the natural choice for that job. So he was made governor of the colony. Right away, they decided that governors could only have a 2-year term, but he was elected 15 times. So he actually served for 30 years. The rumor is, or the legend is, that William Bradford is also responsible for the very first Thanksgiving. The timeline does not quite work out so that that can be true, so it probably is not true. They did, the pilgrims, a group of pilgrims, maybe these guys, maybe not, did have one Thanksgiving feast to celebrate an Indian by the name of Squanto. Squanto had taught them how to plant successful corn crops and just basically to survive when some of the pilgrims had been suffering. And so they had a celebration one time to honor Squanto. After that, the Indians and the Pilgrims will have a falling out, and it will culminate in the colony of Connecticut. But it's the same people now; they're all in New England. It culminates in Connecticut with the death of over 700 natives of mixed tribes, and mostly it was women and children. And they brutally murdered these people. The Pilgrims did. A lot of the murders took place by clubbing the individuals to death. And so to celebrate the death of the heathens that had been, trying to keep them from expanding and being a better colony, they had a celebration and they called it a Thanksgiving. And lots of food and celebration kind of stuff. And after that, it got very, very heated. And every time they had a large Indian kill, they would have another Thanksgiving. So much so that the government got involved and started giving white individuals who had killed natives money for scalps. And so instead of dragging the body of the dead Indian back to your governor, you brought the scalp to prove that you had killed them. And then the governor counted all the scalps and reported back to the crown how many natives had been taken care of. But every time that there was a larger killing, they again had a Thanksgiving, to the point where they were having a Thanksgiving once a week in some areas. It was just becoming a free for all. They got to the point too where it just became so savage. There was one case of an Indian tribe being basically obliterated by a group of pilgrims, and the leader of that tribe was beheaded, as were many males of the tribe, and the pilgrims used their heads to basically bowl with. But the leader of the tribe, his head was taken after they were done playing with it and put on a pole right outside of one of the cities, and it was left there for 24 years. So it was getting really out of hand. When George Washington was made president, he made the suggestion that we celebrate Thanksgiving, and he was okay with it being about Indian killing, but he wanted to celebrate Thanksgiving once a year. And so it was his idea to calm things down, that they would do it once, and every Thanksgiving will be a celebration of, victory over the local heathens. And so it will be a feast once a year with that as the thing they were celebrating. Abraham Lincoln will come along, and during the Civil War, he actually is the president who sets the date and makes Thanksgiving a legal holiday. On that very day, President Lincoln, and I hate to say this because he's one of my favorite people in history, but Lincoln gave the okay to go and massacre an Indian tribe. On the very first legally set in place Thanksgiving. Now, after that, the idea and the connection between Indian killing and Thanksgiving starts to wane, and it becomes a day of being thankful for what you have instead of thankful that you killed a bunch of people. Big difference, but it does start with George Washington setting that one day a year, and then Lincoln making it a legal holiday with a specific date in November, and it goes on to become the thing that we celebrate today. But it definitely was not a celebration between Indians and Pilgrims, except for that one very small party to honor Squanto. So William Bradford wrongfully given credit for the very first Thanksgiving. But what we can give him credit for is saving Plymouth. When they got off the boat, because they had made this covenant community and this covenant promise to God, they kind of decided everything should be communal. They were going to work as this united front to be successful in the new world. And so even agriculture was made a communal effort. It failed miserably. Within a year, half the people died. The crops were so horrible, and I think a lot of it was, they were thinking, well, if Bobby has a good crop, I don't really necessarily have to have a great crop in my little square of the communal garden, because we're all going to share. So you're not like fully vested in it. And Bradford realized this was a problem, and after that first year, he privatized the land, giving each family their own garden or land to garden, and if you didn't grow enough food, your family didn't eat. Well, now you're fully vested, because it's up to you whether your family's going to survive or not. And it was the smartest thing that Bradford ever did. And so we get a very successful Plymouth colony after that very first year. Once you get over being depressed over what Thanksgiving really was, we're going to move on to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was developed in 1629. So, again, we're still in Massachusetts, and you can see from the map over on the right hand side is where we have the Plymouth Colony, and then we're going to also have the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629. Now, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was developed by a man by the name of John Winthrop, and he preached that this new community of Puritans, he is a very strict Puritan, in the New World would be what he called a city upon a hill, watched by the world, and they will be an example of what could be achieved by the Puritans, who had a very strong work ethic and were motivated by their religion and desired to create a government and society that was tied to the church. Because he wanted to make sure that people were following the word of God, he developed the idea of a mandatory church attendance, and it was very, very strict. Only churchgoers were allowed to be part of the government, and they set up their government as with the idea that their government was meant to serve God. But the coolest thing about John Winthrop is he realized that one of the mistakes that early colonies were making is coming unprepared. Well, he didn't come that way. He came prepared with people that knew how to farm, knew how to build, and so this community becomes, just a success right off the bat. They will eventually merge with the Plymouth colony, and that's where we get all of Massachusetts by 1691. So it takes a little bit of time, but they do absorb the Plymouth colony. I've mentioned Puritans to you quite a bit, and you probably studied it last year too when you were talking about the Protestant movement. But let's talk about what it was like in America as a Puritan. So they do again have a covenant community where they have a promise between God and the community that they would be good people and keep their faith strong. So they have a covenant with God. And again, John Winthrop and others agreed that there should be compulsory church attendance. So everybody had to go to church, but you weren't actually a member of the church unless you were part of the group called the elect. Now, if you were an elect, you had to have this miraculous conversion story, like where the day that you decided that you were a Puritan and God like spoke to you and changed your life. It was like this miraculous beautiful thing that happened to you, and you had to get up in front of the rest of the church and tell your conversion story. And of course some of them were like super super fantastic. Well, here's the problem. That worked for the older people when the faith was still new and all these ideas in America were new, but as new generations were coming into the church, that idea of a conversion story or where it suddenly hit me died off because these people, these grown people as children grew up in the households of the elect, and there was no miraculous moment when they realized that they were a good Puritan and full of the faith. They didn't have that moment. They just grew up with that being part of their lives. And so suddenly you're running out of actual members of the church, people that are eligible to be members. And so people are starting to leave the church, and oh my goodness, you can't have that happen, and not in the New England colonies. And so they created the idea of something called a halfway covenant in 1662, and that lessened the church membership needs greatly. And so suddenly, instead of you having to have this conversion story, if your parents were baptized, then and they were members of the elect, then you could also be baptized as their child and be a member of the elect. So now it's a parents are baptized, you get baptized, and suddenly you're an elect instead of this miraculous conversion story. So a Puritan family is very, very focused on the success of the family and the community. This is one of those places, types of places where everybody works together to help one another. And of course, they have that Protestant work ethic that is born in the idea of Calvinism, that if you're a hard worker, that means you're going to go to hell. Or God, you're going to go to heaven. Sorry, you're going to go to heaven if you're a hard worker. Wouldn't it be nice if it was the other way around? But anyway, this group of people thought it was sinful to be crazy with your money. Everybody was thrifty, meaning you didn't spend money unnecessarily. Clothing and everything else was very, very simple. Not a lot of color. That meant that you were vain and that you were showing off, and you're not supposed to be different. You're supposed to be like everybody else and dress in your grays and browns and not show attention to yourself or spend money extravagantly. One of the things that is unique to the New England colonies, and still is today, is the importance of education. Education of their children was very, very important to Puritans, and that meant girls as well. So even today, like I said, they are very into education and believe that that is the key to success. We have to look at New England's economy. We said that they were thrifty. They didn't spend money extravagantly, but they were very good at making money. So you do have farming going on, even though the land is not as wonderful as it is in the South. Some of the farming was done for profit. Most of them were what we call yeoman farmers. They owned small farmers, but they owned their land. It was their land. So yeoman farmers tended to be small farmers, but it's important that you know that they owned their land. Ownership of land was a point of pride in New England. If you weren't a farmer, you were probably into logging. They took those logs and gave them over to guys that knew how to build boats. So that becomes a new thing. And then they take those boats and they use them for fishing and whaling. And of course, like everybody else in America or all the other colonies, you also had a lot of guys that were doing fur trade. So these are all the things that came together to make a very successful economy in New England. Now, the government was also different than it was in the South. In the South, we talked about how you had to own land, and only the rich were allowed to have any say and allowed to have any vote. And you still had liaison from the British Crown that could veto everything. New England is different. New England has what we call direct democracy, straight out of Greece, which means that they had town meetings. You should remember that from World One. At these town meetings, though, only white men were allowed to speak. So, although you might have people of color attending the meeting, they were allowed to attend, but they were not allowed to speak. They do have a very close relationship with the church. All the newspapers and all the schools, anything that they taught about the government, they also taught about religion as well, and they went hand in hand. So we don't have a separation of church and state yet. In the New England colonies, you're going to have a very close relationship with newspapers and schools that promoted the church, and the government set that up. The government is the one that mandated that relationship. Now, there are going to be Indian uprisings throughout the new settlement of New England, but the most famous one is called Metacom's Rebellion or King Philip's War. Now, Metacom he was an Indian of the Wampanoag tribe or federation, and as a child, he watched his father. And that guy's name is like super long. I'm not even going to try to say it because I'll butcher it. But Netacom's father was very, very friendly with the New England settlers, and he was one of the key figures to help them with farming and getting settled. And so King Philip grew up with these white people as maybe not necessarily friends, but not enemies either. Metacom was always kind of a nose in the air kind of figure. He was very haughty, very, very full of himself, very sure of himself. And so, even though his tribal name was Metacom, the settlers, white settlers, began calling him King Philip because he acted like royalty, that he was better than others. And so when they gave him this nickname, it wasn't to, put him down or anything like that. It was just a nickname for a very proud guy. And again, Metacom's father and Metacom himself were members of the tribe that was part of the Wampanoag Federation, and they were not enemies with the New England people until something happened with some cows. Now, how can a cow possibly start causing people to kill each other? Well, here's a story. If you don't know this about cows, cows can smell corn from a long way off and they love it. So the main food of Metacom's tribe and most Indian tribes in that area was corn. And so these cows were allowed to roam free. They did not put fences up. They weren't putting them in barns like we think of today. They were just letting them roam and graze freely. And so, very, very often, they got into the crops and the fields of the natives and destroyed them. It's not like a cow is walking between the rows going, "Oh, excuse me, I don't want to hurt the crops. I just want to ear corn." They were destroying it. And so the Indians went to the settlers and said, "Hey, look, could you do something with your cows?" And basically, they said no. And so the Indians decided that the next time that the cows came in and started to destroy the crops, they were going to do away with the cows. And that's exactly what they did. They killed the cows. Well, you don't do that to colony people. Cows are very expensive. And so it started an all out war between these local Indians and these local colonists. And both sides fought really, really dirty. Both sides decided to target innocent victims like children and women. So many families are going to perish. And in this fight, Metacom says his very, very famous line, "I am determined not to live until I have no country." So he's going to give everything he's got, even if it means giving of his own life. He's going to give everything that he can to make sure that his people don't have to live without their own place. And so the colonists realized that this guy is not going to just give up. He's not going to just give up and go away. So they decide to hire some local Indians that know Metacom and could follow him or track him pretty easily through the wilderness if they needed to. And the word was to wound him and bring him back to justice, in the white among the white people. And so this group of Indians go out and they find Metacom, and one of the guys has him in his sights. He's targeted him, and he says to his friends, "I've got him. I'll wound him. We'll take him back." Well, the guy shot, and he wasn't as good at aim as he pretended to be with his friends, and he ended up shooting Metacom accidentally right through the heart. Metacom was dead before he even fell off of his horse. So horrible end for Metacom, but it basically stopped the war. By that time, there were not a lot of the Wampanoag Federation left. And all the vitality of them died with Metacom. They're never going to fight back again. This becomes the last example of Indian resistance in New England, in all of New England. And a lot of the reason of it is because of the death toll. So, what we have written down in history, and it could be more than this, is that 4,500 natives perished in King Philip's War or Metacom's Rebellion, whichever one you want to call it, and about 1,000 white settlers. That's a lot of loss of life. And so the Indians that were left just kind of disappeared, went someplace else, and the settlers were left with the land to do as they pleased. And so, in the end, they actually won. Just so you know that it wasn't a little teeny tiny one time battle with King Philip's War. In case you happen to notice the years, it was 1675 to 76, so it wasn't super long. But look at what's happening here. You've got it all over Massachusetts. It's all over the place. And you can see that the black kind of star looking things are major Indian attacks on the English, and then the red are vice versa. So you have both sides doing these overnight spontaneous attacks with lots of loss of life. So it involved all of Massachusetts. And pay attention to the fact too that this was happening at the same time that Bacon's Rebellion was happening in Virginia. So 1676. So some really bad things are happening in the colonies in that year, 100 years before we get independence from England. So I also want you to pay attention to the arrows that are going out of Massachusetts across the water. This is the places that they were selling Indians into slavery and shipping them off into the West Indies. So even if you weren't killed, you weren't among that 4,500 that were killed, and you were an Indian, chances are that you were going to be shipped off into slavery, especially if you were a woman and child. They tended to kill more men and ship off the women and the children of the native tribes. We've taken care of the native problem in New England. Let's talk about the female problem in New England. There were females that did not agree with Puritan beliefs of the church, and one of them was Anne Hutchinson. Now, Anne was the mother of 15 children. And Anne decided that she was going to start holding meetings in her own home that for women. There were men that came too, but it was mostly for women. And she was officially charged with breaking the commandment of obeying thy father and thy mother, and of encouraging women to neglect their chores. See, they got to make it sound like she's luring them to her house to hear these lies that she's telling, and women aren't getting their jobs done, and you're not obeying the rules of the house and the rules of the church that your mother and father did. Like, they've got to exaggerate. And so one of the men of the group is that called her a crazy person, basically, or a dissenter, said, "A thing not tolerable nor comely in the sight of God, nor fitting for your sex," in relation to her having meetings and standing up in her own home and talking about the word of God. Women were not supposed to do that. So she is charged with antinomianism. And basically, that means that, again, you're not following the rules of the church. But this one thing is her saying, we cannot know the morals that God believes in. God doesn't speak right to us, and everything that we have set in place as far as what the morals are that we should be living by, and what we consider to be worthy of God's grace, is a human guess. Oh my gosh, that's blasphemous. So when she did this, and again, saying that we don't know really what God wants, is that antinomianism, she's arrested for it at the age of 46. Now, she is a woman. They're not going to kill her. They're not that crazy yet over something like this, but they did not like it that she said the things that she said, and so they can't allow her to stay in in the colony and be a dissenter. So they exile her. That's her punishment. She is exiled from the colony. She's not allowed to be near other people. That will get rid of the female meetings in her home. And so she's actually really pregnant at the time when she's officially kicked out of the colony. And so she begins this journey to Rhode Island, because that's where most of the dissenters went then. It was like the place for the crazy people. So she's on her way, and her little band of people, because it wasn't just her, it was about half of her 15 kids, the one that she was carrying, of course, and some friends that believed in her. They're making this trek to Rhode Island, and they are attacked by Indians, and they're all murdered. So Anne Hutchinson, first woman in New England to really speak out for the rights of women in religion, and what's her fate? She's killed by Indians. So there you go, women. You lost again. So it wasn't just the ladies that were dissenters of this super strict religion in New England. There was also a man, very famous man by the name of Roger Williams, and he spoke out a lot about the disapproval of the treatment, his personal disapproval of the treatment of natives. He had actually lived with the Indians on and off quite often, and he realized that they were people, and he just did not agree with what was happening to natives at the hands of whites. He also went as far as to say that there should not be a church and state relationship, that we should have separation of church and state in New England. Oh my gosh. And that all people should have religious freedom. Now remember, the New Englanders don't really believe in religious freedom. They believe in the freedom to practice their religion. They believe in Christianity, their version of Christianity, but they really do not believe in religious freedom. So he too is exiled, and he's one of the guys that's going to go to Rhode Island and settle that place for kind of a shelter from all these people that were being called dissenters and heretics and had no place else to go once they were exiled. So he's responsible for settling Rhode Island. People that were very often found there were Quakers. People didn't quite understand them. Baptist, of course, because of the idea of complete submersion in baptism, and a lot of them believing that you're not supposed to be baptized until you're an adult. That was considered heretic talk. So they ended up in Rhode Island, and a lot of Jewish people did as well. Don't forget, in many of the colonies, if you were Jewish or atheist, it was still okay to tie you to a cross and burn you. So Roger Williams probably saved a lot of people's lives by settling Rhode Island and opening it up to all religions and non-religions, because there were atheists there too. So he opened it up and definitely saved a lot of people. Of course, we can't leave New England without talking about the Salem witch trials, which took place in 1692 to 93 in the village of Salem. So there's 165 people accused, mostly women. There are some men thrown in there before it's over, but it's mostly women. In total, there were 20 executed. Most of them were killed in by drowning. If you see this picture here that I put up here, that was a method to determine if you were a witch or not. So if you say I'm not a witch, they would put you on this machine and dip you in the water. And supposedly you can't drown a witch. So if you drowned, then oops, you were not a witch because you're a human, you drowned, but you're dead. So it still didn't matter. You weren't guilty of being a witch, and they'd give you a good burial and say they were sorry over your grave, maybe, but you were dead. So once you were accused and sentenced to death, or sentenced to this test, this water test, you were pretty much dead. Now, 5 to 7 people died in prison. We're not really positive exactly how many. We do know that there was one man that they were trying to get him to confess that he was a witch, and they were piling stones on his chest. They had laid him out flat on the ground and tied him down, and they were putting stones on his chest. And every time they said, "Are you a witch?" he would say no, and they would put another stone on his chest and ask him again. And they put so many stones on his chest that it actually caved his chest in. So you had some that were killed accidentally by things like that. Now, today we look back on what exactly caused the Salem witch trials, and later in this unit, we're going to talk about a writer that really got these people stirred up. But one of the theories is misogyny, that it was just this hatred of women. And who hates women more than other women? It started with really young girls that started pointing out older women, saying that they were witches and they had hexed these young girls and made them act all crazy. There is a thought that maybe older women are considered kind of useless because they can't do the same work as a younger woman. They can't have children anymore. So misogyny, either from these young girls who were not crazy about the older women, maybe they looked at them funny or whatever, or really did believe that older women are useless. That seems to be one of the number one theories, that it's women really against women. There's also a theory that it could just be jealousy. Most of the girls that said that they had been bewitched by these witches were of a different economic status than the women they were claiming were the witches. The witches supposedly were the richer people. Some people think that maybe these little girls that suddenly started acting all crazy weren't bewitched, but there actually was a medical reason for it. And one of the reasons that's brought up is often that there was a plant in the area of Salem that has been tested through time, and I can't think of the name of it. But they're saying that maybe things found in nature that these girls ate or got a hold of actually caused them to act a little bit crazy, like taking a kind of drug. Religion was also could possibly be a reason. People were scared to death of the devil, and anybody that was accused of being a witch, people automatically were afraid of you. What if you really are a witch? They're terrified of the occult type of things. And it could also be that fear of Indians has kind of transferred itself, and the chaos of killing natives just was passed on to the chaos of killing each other. So lots of reasons for the Salem witch trials, and the fact that they got so out of hand. But do know that it wasn't hundreds and hundreds of people that were killed like we tend to think. 20 were executed, and then 5 to 7 died in prison. Some of them by accident. Some of them they got pneumonia and died. So it wasn't this free for all like we tend to think of sometimes, and sometimes the movies make it seem that way. You didn't have hundreds of people killed. So that is the sad story of Salem. And I will tell you this, I've been to Salem, really neat place to go, especially at Halloween. So feel sorry for the things that happened there, in history, but now it's a really cool place to go if you like scary stuff. And now we are to the middle colonies. We've done the South, where all they really care about is money and land ownership. We've done the New England colonies, where all they really care about is piety and other religious ideas. And now we are on to the middle colonies. Let's see what we got here. The middle colonies are much easier and much quicker than the other two, but we have to talk about William Penn. So William Penn is going to create a haven for Quakers in 1681 in Pennsylvania. Now, you guys already know by now that colonists were stealing land from the Indians everywhere up and down the coast, but not Penn. Penn traveled unarmed among Indians and negotiated peaceful purchases. So not maybe not even with money, but he made deals with these local tribes. Nobody ever got hurt for him to settle Pennsylvania. So he creates this haven for Quakers. Remember, the only other place they'd really been able to be is Rhode Island. And so he creates this place where women are considered equal to men. Believe it or not, he gave Pennsylvania a written constitution that limited the power of the government. He wanted to make sure that anybody that was imprisoned was not mistreated, and so he provided a humane penal code, and he guaranteed fundamental liberties to people. Now his liberties were taken away from him quite a bit back in England. Maybe that's why he was so into it in America. But he got imprisoned at least 6 times. These are the times that we know of in England for different things. Nothing bad, nothing ever violent. Mostly it was because he had a big mouth and he wanted to speak out about equality, and he got in trouble for it. But while he was in these prisons in England, he used his time to write Quaker pamphlets that basically taught you how to be a Quaker, and he set up what he thought would be an ideal government for this place that he had planned on settling in the New World. And so he made good use of his time when he was in prison those 6 times. Now, he was a pacifist. He believed in complete freedom of religion. He did not believe in any kind of violence, and he was an egalitarian. Like I said, he thought that women should be equal. He went as far as to say everyone should be equal, including Native Americans. Here's the only problem with William Penn. We celebrate him as a really good guy and a hero, and this guy who preached, egalitarian ideas, everybody is equal, but he did own slaves. So this is a perfect example of the time period and the fact that you can take the greatest guy ever and put him in a place where something evil like slavery is accepted, and he might do it too. So do you blame the guy or do you blame the times? But he did own slaves, and that's the truth of it. So we looked at the government and society in the North and the South. It's different in the middle colonies. They were a very democratic government, just like not just in Pennsylvania, but the whole thing. They did have more diversity than the North or the South did, or New England or South did. You do need to know the major ethnic groups in the different colonies. So, New York, you have Jews, a lot of French Huguenots. Don't forget, a French Huguenot is a Calvinist, and then you had a lot of people, Dutch people there. New Jersey is Presbyterians, and Pennsylvania is Germans. Make sure you know those. The thing that's really cool about the middle colonies is diverse ideas and ethnic groups was welcome, and they did actually have a middle class. The middle class, they weren't working in factories yet, but the middle class were artisans in the cities that had enough people living in the same area. They're They're not spread far out like they were in the South, where you may not see another human being for months other than your personal family members. And you were allowed to make pretty things here, unlike the New England colonies. So these artisans made all kinds of stuff and sold them at little store shops and on street corners in the middle colonies, and made a good living at it. So it's very much less stratified than the South, where land meant wealth and power, and it's the rich people that are making all the rules. This was just a different place, and probably a place that I would have rather been than the other two, to be honest. So as I said, we have the artisans there, but let's look at the other economic characteristics. You are on the water for these a lot of these middle colonies. A lot of people lived on the water, so of course you're going to have seaports with trading. We've talked about this earlier in the unit. Everybody farmed, everybody. So whether you have a little tiny farm with the yeoman farmers in New England, or maybe you're in the South with a subsistence farmer, or maybe you have a giant plantation in the South, or you might just have like an average, ordinary, not giant, not too small farm in the middle colonies. Land there was easy to acquire, and you didn't have rich people shoving the poor people, and the guys that used to be indentured servants. You didn't have them shoving them westward. So if you chose to be a farmer, that was a way of life, and if the crops did okay and the weather agreed, then you could be very successful. You did have wage laborers too, believe it or not. So these artisans may need help in their shops. The bartenders might need help in their bars. So you do actually have people that are making a regular wage in these businesses in these cities. So it's very diverse. You can actually pick a career in a lot of these cities and be something different than anybody's able to dream from a New England colony or a Southern colony. We've gone through all the different regions, so let's kind of look at them in a nutshell. Let's start with colonial life overall. I want to kind of put it in a chart form so you've got it all in one place. All right, so I am not going to read this for you. What I would do is just pause this video, and if you don't have this, in a way that you can study it, look at it and study it for your notes, then now's the time to do it. So you decide if that's what you need to do to help yourself study this stuff better and memorize it. But you do need to know the differences in these three categories: social, political, and economic. That's what history is all about. So pause and do some writing for me. Now, there are some things that all the colonies begin to have in common with one another, and that is their relationship with England. So we see these first little seeds of discontent start among all the colonies, and really a lot of it starts with the theory of mercantilism, and that idea that you, as a colony, your job is to make money for the mother country. So mercantilism, of course, has all these rules that are set in place, and they are called navigation acts. And these are rules to make mercantilism successful, where mommy country makes lots of money. So navigation acts started in 1651, and some of them got completely outrageous. There were cases where you had to leave one colony with your ship loaded down with goods, go all the way to England, pay a tax as they, look through your boat, and then go back to another colony, sail all the way back across the Atlantic Ocean to the colony that you were destined for, and sell your goods. So you're making this way out of the way trip to pay taxes to the mother country, England, just to take your stuff up the coastline of the continent you live on. So it really was a waste of money. Sure, England got their tax, but it was a waste of money for the colonies, and they didn't like it. And there were a lot of other acts that were really silly like that as well. Now, on a whole, during the early years, the 1600s, all through the 1600s, the colonies were going through salutary neglect, which basically meant that England wasn't really enforcing any laws in the New World. Now, we do have governors there that are appointed by the crown, but once you're over here and you're among the people in the new colonies and stuff, are you really doing exactly what the king would have wanted you to do, or do you become one of the colonists? So things evolved over time into a rise in self-government. What the people, the local people here in South America really wanted for their conditions in their colony. And all the colonies were different. Like one colony needed one thing and the other colony didn't need that. They needed something totally different. There was also a lot of smuggling going on. The Navigation Acts kind of made people want to smuggle to not have to do the stupid pay taxes, go all the way back to England and pay taxes and some of the other silly rules. So there was smuggling going on and everybody was doing it. And again, you're experiencing salutary neglect. Your government in England's not doing anything about it. So it was kind of like everybody knew it was happening. You knew it was illegal, but people just did it because everybody did it. Most families had somebody doing it, so it just kind of happened. And then later, when the British government tries to put a stop to it, of course, how can you say stop it now after 100 years? So there are specific areas of contention between New England and these colonies, and one of them very specifically is frontier defense. Why is the crown not protecting those people that are out in the frontier, the western part of these colonies? There's no protection for them. The richer people live along the shore. That's the ones that the English care about because that's where the ports are. That's where they're going to make money. And so those people that are not in cities, and I'm talking all up and down the coast, not just in the south, but all up and down the coast. If you live westward, there's no protection for you. The crown has not sent anybody over. And so that makes people really upset. And overall, you've got this idea of these colonies want to control themselves. And every once in a while, the crown rears his ugly head and wants to have the control. So it's definitely a very fertile ground for discontent. And the big thing, of course, is trade because the crown is still trying to give them directions through mercantilism and the navigation acts on who to trade with, how to trade with them, the price of the goods that are being traded. And so, how can you practice salutary neglect for government? But then you stick your hands in all the rules of their trade. It just did not make sense. So overall, right away in the 1600s now, when the colonies are first forming, you've already got all these reasons that the colonies, all of them, all 13, are starting to get upset with England and seeing that relationship being strained. Locally, these colonies are also going through kind of a phenomenon called the Great Awakening. And this is an awakening to religion. The Enlightenment had caused a lot of people to turn to the idea of deism. And if you remember this from your vocabulary, deism means you believe that God doesn't interfere with the world or interact with mankind. So he listens to your prayers maybe, but he's not going to answer them because that means that he would have to interfere. And a lot of people saw this as a loss in faith. Not and really, I mean, deists believe in God. They just don't believe that God moves us down as moves us around like chess pieces or grants our wishes. But a lot of people were worried that faith was going by the wayside. So it begins with Calvinist. Calvinists are the ones that are most concerned, of course, and so they begin a revival, a Protestant revival, and it takes place for 20 to 40 years between the 1720s and the 1740s, and it is again supposed to awaken believers to their sins. Now this is going to be a different kind of style. You've got more of an evangelical type of minister. And you maybe have seen this at least on television, if not in real life, where you have these tents set up and these giant groups of people come, and it's kind of a show. It's not so much just a sermon. It's kind of a show that is put on by these religious leaders. Some people didn't like that, and those are called the old lights. They did not believe in evangelical ministry. They thought that it should be the old, go into a church. It's very quiet. This guy gets up on stage. He gives a sermon. He's not up there shouting. He's not being entertaining. He's just giving you the word of God. The old lights like the fact that traditional training for ministers should be kept in place and that they should be kind of stoic. Now, the new lights said, no, we want them to be entertaining. New lights, a lot of them were women too, where the old lights were males. So there are a lot of differences between the old and new. Now, does that mean all of the old fashioned religious ministry is going away? No. It's still there for the people that want that, but you have a new type of religious celebration as well. And the reasons that they had to change this is because they had to find a reason for people to come back to the church. And if somebody says to you, hey, I saw, Pastor so and so doing a sermon last weekend, and man, it was good. I went home like I was energized, and I felt full of the Spirit, and it was just wonderful, then it might get the people that he's telling this story to come to the next sermon. So they had to have some kind of change. And they also had to travel in this evangelical kind of mode with these tents, because there were a lot of people. Remember, we talked about people at the foothills of Appalachia that had no way to get to a town where there might be a school or a weekly job. So if they don't have any of that, they don't have a church either. They're very isolated, and so the churches felt that they needed to bring religion to the people instead of waiting for the people to come to them. And so it becomes a traveling show during the Great Awakening to get to these isolated people. Just like actors that we have now, key figures of the Great Awakening had kind of a different method, one from another, to how to get people's attention. And one of the most famous of all the speakers during the Great Awakening was a man by the name of Jonathan Edwards. And his most famous speech that he gave at one of these evangelical gatherings was called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And basically, he just seemed very stoic, very quiet, very intense, but he spoke with great conviction that he was absolutely positive that the devil is everywhere, and if you do something horrible, even a little bit, God is going to be very, very angry with you, and you're going to burn in hell. And he does this description of hell that just scares the crud out of people. And believe it or not, there are actually there's three documented cases of people committing suicide during his sermon because they figured that they were going to go to hell and they might as well just go ahead and get it started. So they killed themselves while he was speaking in this scary tone. And if you really want to hear it, I know I can't click on the link here and send it to you, but if you go to YouTube and you type in "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," you'll hear Jonathan Edwards. And at first you're going to be like, this guy's not scary at all. Like he doesn't speak loud, and he's not dramatic, but pay attention to the words he's saying. Listen for a little bit. He's kind of scary. And when you're talking about the time period where people wholeheartedly believed in these religious figures and what they had to say, and this Jonathan Edwards portrays God as an angry judge that's going to do these extreme punishments to you, it scared people. But think about this too. If you go to a really scary movie, don't you go back and tell people about it? You tell your family, you tell your friends, you got to see this movie. It was so scary. I thought I was going to pee my pants. And even though you're saying it's really scary, your friends and family are going to go watch it. You want to watch it. And so he figured out this way to get people to come to his sermons by scaring them. Pretty smart. Now, I said that these ministers, if you want to call them that, had different ways of getting people's attention. And one of the very different guys, very very different from Jonathan Edwards, is George Whitefield. George Whitefield was an actor by profession. But he turned to this idea of the Great Awakening because he could be super theatrical. Like he could act and be on stage every night. And so for him, this was a really cool opportunity to get up on stage. And he was a Christian. He wasn't super sure about the idea of predestination, so he doesn't really fit in with the Calvinist idea. Of predestination, even though this was started as a Calvinist idea, he's going to turn it in a different direction. Still religious, but he was super, super popular. He had thousands of people attend each one of his sermons, and where Jonathan Edwards might convert 20 people at a time to his way of thinking and actually get them up on stage and convert them to Christianity, this guy had untold numbers, this George Whitefield. We don't even know how many, and he was willing to convert anybody. It didn't matter if you were a man, a woman, an Indian, a slave. He would convert anybody, and he was so entertaining. He would weep and scream and get everybody super excited and just jump all over the stage, and just things that nobody had ever seen him do before. Even this gigantic religious skeptic known as Benjamin Franklin, the Benjamin Franklin, on the way out, he emptied his coin purse and gave a donation to this George Whitefield's church because he was the most entertaining person he'd ever heard. So he Ben Franklin went there to kind of heckle him when Whitefield was appearing in Philadelphia, and ended up loving the guy and emptying his purse out for him. And Ben Franklin was cheapskate, but he gave this guy all his money so that he would, have money to go on and do another show. So that says a lot about the entertainment ability of George Whitefield. And remember, this is religion and entertainment too. So he's not up there just acting out, Henry V or something. He's preaching, and it was done in a very entertaining way. So let's look at the overall results of the Great Awakening. It's the first event that the colonies all share. And so it's going to give them a sense of unity with one another, not England, but one another. It also allows for a complete change in the religion. Many people called it rebellious thinking, but for the first time ever, not all preachers were ordained. You had laymen that got up there and prayed for the audience in a public venue, and basically you were saying that anyone was capable of praying, even women. Oh my goodness, even women are allowed to pray. So some of the old lights called this too rebellious and walked away, but they still had their own faith. They still believed in God. So you have these different types of religion, but it is a coming back to religion, whether you are an old light or a new light. This also caused a more democratic spirit, because you have these choices in religion now. So if you can actually have a choice in religion and allow a layman to speak, allow a woman to preach, you still can't get over that, then of course you're going to start having a democratic spirit about everything, including your government, including your economy. So the religions just kept changing and growing more and more and more, and we see new religious groups, especially the evangelical ones, the ones that are crazy and loud and theatrical and travel. Many people are born again at these evangelical sermons, and they're seeking piety. They want to do the right thing, go to heaven, have a chance at a perfect forever. Some of the groups that are going to come out of the Great Awakening, well, the two main groups are the Methodist and the Baptist. The Baptist being the one, of course, that is most radical because they believed in complete submersion when you're being baptized. And they also, many of them believe that you should not be baptized until you're an adult. This is completely different than what people had ever believed before. So it truly was a great awakening to new ideas in religion. We have to talk about the ladies of colonial America, and this is in general, okay? I'm not talking about whether you're New England, Middle, or Southern. This is in general. But a lot of the women migrated for the same reasons that men did. They wanted a new opportunity, whether it was religion or wealth or position. They wanted a new life for themselves and something better. Rights, of course, are going to vary among communities and among the different colonies, but here's your generality. Okay, women came here hoping they were going to have something better, but they still have no right to vote, very limited property rights. Some places are better than others, but very limited. They had no right to their own children. Their children were seen as property of the husband. So if for some reason the marriage ends, she, of course, is going to be considered untouchable because, her husband didn't want her. She must have done something bad. But on top of that, she could lose her kids and never see them again. He owns them. So, husband, if he wants to, can take all the kids and never let her see them again. So the roles in general of a woman are to have as many kids as possible. This, of course, is going to lead to a lot of death among women because if you're like Anne Hutchinson and you're pregnant with baby number 16, that's pretty hard on a woman. So a lot of women died young because they got pregnant, one time after another, after another, after another. That's really hard on a woman's body. So much so that many, many, many men refer to their current wife as the new wife. Rather than her name, they just referred to her as the new wife because your wives died off. And of course, you got remarried because you wanted to have more kids. But anyway, getting back to what the women were all about. Women were supposed to maintain the home and the resources. Women worked from sunup to sundown doing the woman chores, the cooking, the cleaning, but she was also expected to help her husband with the farming. And this is where the many children come in because the more kids she had, the lighter the load for her in the home, and the less likely it was that her husband might need help out in the fields. So having children did benefit her. Women were not allowed to work outside the home. That was forbidden. No matter what your family situation was, in almost all of the colonies, in almost all the towns in the colonies, women were not allowed to work outside the home. And women that did work outside the home were considered not nice girls. The last topic we're going to talk about are some of the more important and prominent writers in colonial America. And we're only going to do three of them. And believe it or not, ladies, I'm doing this for you. Two of the three are going to be women. So let's start with the man and then we'll save the best for last. We'll do the ladies after that. So here is Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was born in Boston, Massachusetts, in the Bay Colony. He was a Puritan. You do need to know this about him right now. It won't make sense to you because we haven't learned this man yet, but I want you to know it in your notes, and I'll remind you of it later in a few units. But he helped to get rid of Sir Edmund Andros. Write that guy's name down. It's going to matter later. Okay, so let's get back to Cotton Mather and what he did. Cotton was the son of a witch hunter. His dad really truly was a witch hunter. So he grew up believing that there were witches in the world, and he even went as far as to have contacted a family he had heard about who had four children, and according to local lore, all four children were possessed. So he actually took the eldest child, she was 13 years old, to live with him so he could study her, and he wrote this book about her called The Remarkable Providences, A Story of Possession. And that book became really, really popular. It just so happened to coincide to the start of the Salem witch trials, and people had read his writings. They believed in Cotton Mather and the things that he said about witches and possession, and he was around there at the time, and so his writing and his just being there led to the hysteria of the or at least help the hysteria of what was happening during the witch trials. Now, later he realized too late that he had really stirred up this hornet's nest and people were getting killed because of it, but it was too late by then to go back and say, hey, sorry, I made a mistake. And so his presence in his writing really did probably help to get some of those 20 people killed during the Salem witch trials, sadly. We can't talk about writers without talking about Anne Bradstreet. She was the first poet and first female to be published in the New World, and that happened in 1650. Her father was actually friends with Cotton Mather. She was in Salem as well. She was different than the other females there. She was different than most people there. She never really worried about salvation. She didn't really join in the worries over whether or not she was going to hell. She just wanted to write. She did have 8 children with her husband, but she didn't have kids just because that was supposed to be her job as a woman in the colonies. She had sexual relationships, according to her now, she had sexual relationship with her husband because she liked it. And women didn't talk about sex back then. So Anne Bradstreet somehow, some way, by some miracle, got her stuff published. And women of the colonies were amazed by it. That here's a woman who's actually talking about sex, for one, but actually saying she enjoys it, for two. So these 2 lines here that you see are her talking about her husband and how, basically he makes her melt, kind of thing. So you can read that on your own. But here we have the first poet and first female published in the New World, and of course it's all about sex, right? And then we come to Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis, sometimes you'll see her name spelled with a Y in there, Phyllis. Either way is correct. She spelled it both ways. But she's the first published black female poet in America. She came straight from Africa at the age of 8, and she was sold to a family in Boston. Lucky for her, because they were not afraid to allow her to read and write like people in the South were. So they encouraged her to read and write and saw that she had this great talent and actually helped to get her published. And so if you read the piece of poetry over here, you can see the white influence on the way that she thinks about her own people. They like basically, and I'll read that first line to you. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, Africa, taught me my benighted soul to understand." So she's actually saying that she's glad that she came to America, or thankful, because it was her salvation. So you can see the white influence here in her thinking. And that is Phyllis Wheatley. And that is the end of this unit. So start studying. Good luck.